Hi, welcome back to another podcast with Mr. Hagan. And on this podcast, we are going to continue to look at production in countries. And on previous podcasts, we looked at that production over time in the short run. And in the short run, production over time creates this thing called the business cycle. We looked at the details on the previous podcast. And then in the long run, that production for the United States, at least, looks like this. It's a story of increasing production over time. Yes, there are still the business cycles that are happening in the short run, and here was a big one with the Great Depression and World War II. So we have the short run stories of the business cycles, and then we have the long run story of increasing production over time. Now the question becomes, how do we measure this thing called production? So we measure that, economists measure this by calculating what is called gross domestic product. And this is calculated in the United States every quarter. Every 3 months, we calculate the gross domestic product. So what is it? Gross domestic product definition is the total market value, and I'm going to highlight 4 parts to this definition as I go through it. It's the total market value, that's going to be important, of all final goods and services. That word final is going to be very important. This should be within a country, specifically within the country's borders, and in 1 year. Okay, those are all the important parts of the definition. So let's look at them each individually. When I say market value, I mean the value of the products that we produced. That value is measured by the price of the product. So this kind of goes back to our supply and demand, which we talked about a lot on previous podcasts. You have demand for an individual good or service. You have supply for an individual good or service, and that generates a price for the individual good or service, and that price is the market value. So to figure out the market value of all the apples that were produced, say in the United States, we take the price of all the apples multiplied by the quantity of all the apples, and that gives us the total value of all the apples that were produced. But of course, we're trying to add up all goods and services produced in our society. So we have to take the price of apples, and we have to add to that the price of all the bananas, the price of bananas times the quantity of all the bananas that were produced in the United States. And that gives me the total market value of all the bananas that were produced. And then we have to add to that the total market value of all the cars that we produced in the United States, and so on for all the goods and services that we produce. We take the quantity of the goods that we produced, multiply it by the price, which gives us the market value. We add them all up, and that gives me the total market value of all goods and services produced within the United States. So that's what I mean when I say market value. What is the value of all the goods and services in the market? And then add them all together. And we'll look at details of that later on. When I say final goods and services, okay, this is important because we're only going to count final goods and services. We're not going to count what are called intermediate goods that are used to make other products, and I'll come back to this in a little bit more detail in a minute. These goods have to be produced within the country's borders. So if an American company produces cars in Japan, then that would not count as American gross domestic product. That would count as Japan's gross domestic product. So it has to be produced within the country's borders to count it as its gross domestic product. And finally, we calculate this over 1 year, typically from January 1st to December 31st. Okay, so that's the total market value of all final goods and services produced within a country's borders in 1 year. Let's look more closely at this idea of final goods versus what I call the intermediate goods. So a final good is a good in the hands of the final user. This might be a car, might be a computer, might be a refrigerator, things like this, things that we consume, or maybe that governments buy, or whatever it happens to be. This is the good. It's not going to be sold again. Okay, that's maybe one way to think about it. The product isn't going to be sold again. It's in the hands of the final user. They're done. They're going to now use the product that they have. That's in contrast to an intermediate good. An intermediate good is an input used towards the production of a final good. And it's typically purchased by one firm from another firm. Okay, so this would mean, and we do this, by the way, we don't count these intermediate goods, because if we do, that will cause us to double count. Okay, and we want to avoid double counting. So what do I mean by this? What do I mean by this? Be a little more specific. Let's look at an example. So let's say that a car company buys tires for $1,000, and they buy glass for $2,000, and they buy steel for $5,000, and they buy leather for $2,000. Now, tires, glass, steel, leather, they all got produced. They all need to get counted in the gross domestic product. However, we don't count them when the car company buys them. Why not? Because when the car company buys them, they are intermediate goods that are being used to make another good, which is the car. Okay, so all that gets counted as part of gross domestic product is the final good, and that is the car. So let's say this. The car company buys tires for $1,000. They buy glass for $2,000. They buy steel for $5,000. They buy leather for $2,000. Tires, glass, steel, and leather, they were all produced. They all need to be counted as part of the gross domestic product. However, if we count these when the car company buys them, we will end up double counting them. We'll count them as if they were produced twice. Why? Because when the end user buys the car, this is the final good or service. When the end user buys the car, they are also buying all of these. When they pay $25,000 for the car, part of that is they are also buying the leather, they're buying the steel, they're buying the glass, they're buying the tires. These are all in the car. So when the final user buys the car, all of these are getting picked up as production. They're all getting counted as production and being part of the gross domestic product. Now, if I count these when the car company buys them, and then I count them again when the final user buys them, then I'll be counting them twice. It'll look like we produced twice as many tires as we really did. Okay, so here's the car company, and here's the final user, and then here are the tires. So what's happening here is the car company is buying the tire, and then they're using the tire to finish the car, to put onto the cars, and then they're selling those cars to the final user. So the tires are getting counted once, they're getting counted twice if we count them when the car company buys them and when the final user buys them. We don't want to do that. We don't want to count tires twice. There was only $1,000 of tires that were produced here, so we only want to count tires once. We only want to count those $1,000 of tires. So this first time, we don't count it. We don't count it because we label it as an intermediate good. So the tires only get counted when the final user buys them. It only gets counted when the final user buys them. When I buy the car, I am buying the tires and the glass and the steel and the leather, and they're getting counted as part of gross domestic product. Okay? So that helps us to avoid double counting by ignoring intermediate goods and only counting final goods. Okay? So gross domestic product, total market value of all final goods and services, only final goods and services produced within a country's border in 1 year. Okay? We'll talk more about that on another podcast. Thanks for joining me. This has been Mr. Hagan. See you on the next podcast.